Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Trey Hanbury with Hogan Lovells. Thank you for joining us for this panel discussion, FirstNet, what FirstNet can offer commercial carriers. We're glad to have you here today, and we're honored to have a very distinguished panel joining us to talk about what FirstNet can offer commercial carriers. Joining us today, we have, to my immediate left, Brett Hahn, who is a principal at Deloitte. Mr. Hahn has more than 25 years of background in the telecom field, including leading commercial telecom enterprises, working for the FCC, and helping to shape telecom policy in both the US and Europe. Mr. Hahn is program director of the 800 megahertz transition administrator, a daunting task that is hopefully nearing completion. And next on the panel, we have Brett Kilbourne. Brett currently serves as Vice President of Government and Industry Affairs and Deputy General Counsel at the Utilities Telecom Council, where he provides legal guidance to utilities on telecom issues. Prior to joining UTC, Mr. Kilbourne worked at Bell South Corporation as well as Baker and Hofstadter. Next, we have Morgan O'Brien, a pioneer in U.S. wireless telecom. He was co-founder and chairman of my former company, Nextel Communications. He led to the creation of the first all-digital nationwide wireless network and brought push-to-talk communications to the mass market. Mr. O'Brien was recognized as an RCR Person of the Year in both 1993 and 2006, which spans quite a bit of time, so we're honored to have Morgan joining us today. Finally, we have Patrick Rehnquist, the Vice President of Wireless Networks for Erickson North America, where he's responsible for Ericsson's North American direction for expanding and evolving mobile networks. He has extensive experience in wireless networking, from first-generation analog systems all the way to 4G LTE. Please welcome all of our panelists today. And if you would like a more thorough bio, you can check it out on the CCA app. So if you want to, all right, thank you. So I wanted to launch right into it, and we will allow some time for question and answer toward the end. But Brett Hahn, I'd like to start with you. And we do have two Bretts on our panel, so I'll go ahead and use your last names just to make clear who we're talking to. But earlier this year, Brett, you wrote that for FirstNet to succeed, its leadership had to accept two premises. You said that the public safety broadband network must be state-centric, addressing the needs of its primary users. And you said it will require collaboration with states, federal entities, and commercial telecom carriers. So let's take each of these two premises. First, why must FirstNet be state-centric? I mean, isn't FirstNet a national network? And isn't state-centric policy what got us into the interoperability mess in the first place?
Well, thank you very much. First off, I want to thank my fellow panelists in CCA for arranging this, particularly that there's two Bretts on the panel. I was only looking for Brett Favre to join us. But to answer your question, which I think is really good, I am a firm believer that it does need to be a state-centric policy. First off, because legislation demands that. But also, what are we thinking about this? The purpose of FirstNet is to help our country respond to a national incident. And the governors of his or her states are the key officials for that. They can bring up their National Guard. They coordinate with their state police and obviously the city and county local responders. So you need that governor, that state participation. Also, from a business perspective, the states are the customers. I think Admiral Barnett wrote a very good article on what should FirstNet do first. The worst thing is to build a plan that is ignored. States are the customers, and state and local users are the customers. And also, the governors have the holistic view of their state's broadband needs. So both in public safety and non-public safety, and then within public safety, they can also think about their holistic needs, whether in 700, 800, or other bands. It cannot be separated as a 700 only issue. And per that, I want to use from a user perspective, the legislation, the very same legislation that created FirstNet, also mandated that public safety get out of what's called the T-band. And this is for major cities the biggest issue. NIPSTIC, which at the previous panel some members were talking about, estimated that it would be about $6 billion to move T-band. The reason this is important, I'll use LA as an example. LA had a BTOP award that's been kind of put in limbo, and hopefully we commend Sue Swenson for aggressively trying to work with all the BTOP recipients so they can go forward. But that BTOP award has been temporarily halted. They're doing 800 megahertz reconfiguration is coming up. Plus, they have to move T-band, and that's the most important thing. So from a customer perspective, all your major cities throughout the United States, whether it's LA, Boston area, Chicago, have to move T-band. So they need to figure out how to allocate their dollars, and this is a $6 billion check, which they weren't thinking of writing. So from a customer viewpoint, you need that, and that's where the states are clearly there. Now, per that state side, I would say this is where the CCA can have a significant influence. I was really pleased to hear Sue Swenson and others talk about a state-centric role as well. Your companies are part of that political business ecosystem for your state. You are constituents to that governor. And getting the governors educated up to this is really critical, along with, no pandering for my fellow Brett, along with the utilities. Your utility companies, your rural carriers are critical to the success of FirstNet and critical to, particularly to rural states. And educating your governor why, for your local constituents, your local jobs, your local networks, how you can participate in this, I think is really important. That's why I think a state-centric is legislative required, but also in the real world, and in order for FirstNet to be a success, it has to have the partnership of states, the rural carriers, and I would also contend the utilities to make the full system work.
Now, your second premise, and I want to turn for this part to Morgan a little bit. You talk about partnerships and collaborations between federal and state users, and we heard from Sue that historically we've not seen close collaboration. Instead, we've seen walls and barriers, and often for good reasons, sometimes less so. But it's not an area where we have historically seen a great deal of collaboration. So is this public safety collaboration that you're envisioning, especially under a state-centric approach, just going to be too complex, too complicated to allow for a commercial partnership? And if we have if we have 50 states, if we have peculiar local flavors, how is a commercial operator to respond in that environment? So Morgan, for that, if we could turn to you for a moment.
Well, there's no way I would hold this out to be uncomplicated. In fact, it'll be extremely complicated. But it'll be complicated in a different way in each state. If you think about it, every state has a different political reality, a different topography, demography. Some states are blessed and have big, luscious, what we call NFL markets that will much more easily lend themselves to monetizing the excess capacity. Other states are not so blessed. So I'm completely aligned in my thinking with Brett that the basic building block just logically has to be the states. And this has nothing to do with opt-in, opt-out. I think opt-out it will be a terrible outcome if that's the way this plays out. But having said that, having acknowledged how bad opt-out would be, at the same time, you have to say, in an opt-in scenario, putting the state in at the ground floor to decide really its future LMR system, because ultimately, this 20, actually 30 megahertz of 700 megahertz spectrum, which is available to public safety in every state, that 30 megahertz over time with technology is going to begin to dwarf whatever else they have. So it's critical from the outset for the state to buy into and be part of how this is going to look. On the other hand, of course, achieving a nationwide interoperability, seamlessness is extremely important and is the overriding reason for doing this in the first place. But again, with an apology for the complexity that it involves, I think the structure is in place for FirstNet to make sure they ensure that interoperability, that national flavor, but I don't think that should be at the expense of putting the states in at the ground floor. I can't see the logic any other way.
Mm-hmm. And Brett Kilbourne, let's turn to you for a moment. You've also talked about public-private partnerships and how it might work, coming from the utilities perspective. And you had a blog recently where you quoted one public safety official, and I've heard this before. We want interoperability with utilities, and we also want their money to support it. So is a public-private partnership really just a way to squeeze the lemon juice out of the big carrier lemon, or is this a two-way street, and how does it work for utilities in particular?
Okay, so first off, echo everyone else here on the panel. Just happy to be here. Thank you for inviting us. So utility companies do work hand in hand with public safety during emergencies. So we do need interoperability in those cases, and we don't have it. We have workarounds. There's nothing perfect. So, the Commission, when it put together the National Broadband Plan, actually recognized this and understood that, it made sense for utility companies and public safety to partner up when it came to building a nationwide broadband public safety network, in part because we have similar communication needs. We also have extensive infrastructure that we can provide. And conversely, public safety has access to the spectrum that utility companies so desperately need. We are under increasing demand for additional services to our customers. Smart grid is just one example of that. And while utility companies have this increasing demand, most of their spectrum right now is just narrowband, and it's subject to interference and congestion or reallocation for commercial services. So we're more than eager to work with public safety, whether it's state and local or FirstNet, to try and meet our respective needs going forward.
I totally understand that the utilities are eager. Do the utilities occupy the field, though? I mean, one of the recent pleadings from UTC said that FirstNet really needs to consider other options besides one or even several commercial wireless service providers for that public-private partnership. So is there room, if utilities partner with public safety, for anyone else, such as the
absolutely.
CCA members?
Yes, exactly.
Explain
yes,
how
yeah.
that might work.
We're here to spread the love. No, utility companies are by no means in any position to think that we're going to dominate this build-out. The way we see it is that it's much more important to have a flexible, open, transparent process that encourages RFPs, for some or entire or part of the entire network, rather than a one-shot, one-size-fits-all type of RFP that only gives one opportunity to take a bite at the apple. We think that would be very wasteful, and especially if you're trying to serve those rural areas. Utility companies obviously do have coverage in those rural areas. We think we can contribute greatly to that, and I think that's something that we share with the CCA members.
Do you think there are specific aspects of the infrastructure that you contribute? Is it technical know-how? What are the utilities' unique contributions to the process?
Well, that's one of the nice things about utilities. I mean, they have extensive infrastructure. We have substations out in remote areas, even where commercial services aren't available, hence the reason that we went out and built private internal networks in the first place. But we also have on staff a lot of resources that we can provide, and those resources are obvious when there's a hurricane. Our trucks are out there setting poles. And that's I think that's something to be commended in today's environment, that utility companies still maintain those kind of resources, and they're ready and willing to try and contribute those towards communities that they serve.
Thanks. Patrick, I wanted to bring you into the conversation here. The upper 700 megahertz band is almost entirely held by Verizon Wireless, which holds the 22 megahertz C block license in very close proximity to what is now the FirstNet wireless broadband spectrum. Given this band configuration, can any carrier other than Verizon be a partner to public safety?
So thank you for the question, and as all the others on the panel, I'm very happy to be here and honored to address this very important topic. So your question is related to network sharing and spectrum sharing, and the fact that operators may have different starting points. So network sharing and spectrum sharing could be one of the foundations for a partnership between FirstNet and an operator. But as was stated out earlier this morning, any partnership has to be a win-win situation, meaning the operator has to put in certain assets, and so does FirstNet, and the outcome should be a win-win for both parties. Now, both operators and FirstNet they have different assets that they can bring to the table. And it depends a little bit on their different starting points and what they have. So it's very hard to generalize. You need to be specific from a specific operator point of view. So let's focus a little bit on FirstNet and what they can bring to the table for a second. Right. So they can, of course, bring a number of different things. They talked about it this morning, device ecosystem. They can bring in access to sites that the operator may not have. They're roaming and some revenue associated with that, but also money. They have some money, so that could lower the cost for building a network. Now, the main asset is probably the spectrum, and that goes back again to the question then, right? How do you effectively share spectrum? Ken Böttger this morning talked about different types of network sharing models. I will not go into that and repeat that. He stated it very well. But I think that the conclusion from that, or my conclusion from that, is that there are standards available and there are ways to share networks equally for all operators, irrespective of their starting point. And in fact, we Ericsson, we have built and we are operating shared network between commercial operators on a global basis. So we do have a lot of experience from this, and we do understand how it works and that it can work in the commercial operator world.
So just to put a fine point on it, you don't see proximity to the FirstNet network spectrum as a gating criterion?
It's certainly not a gating criteria. There are many assets that you bring into building a network as we discussed this morning, and many different operators have different assets to bring to the table. So you have to enter into a partnership discussion. And in our experience, the key stumbling block, or what could be a stumbling block, is not the technology, but the business model and the governance around the partnership. And that, again, points to the need for an operator, and especially members of CCA, to talk in the rural setting, to talk to their states, to understand what is the plans of the states, so you align with the states. And I think in some ways the CCA members, especially in the rural community, then have an advantage over someone like Verizon, who may not be as connected in those areas. My speculation.
Well, Morgan, we just heard from Patrick that it's not the technology, but it's the business model and the governance structure around which the partnership will really grow. And perhaps more than anyone, you pioneered the notion of a public-private partnership for public safety when you founded Siren Call and put forward a plan back in 2006 for a private company to run the public safety network. Siren Call didn't prevail, but your notion of a public-private partnership is carried on. So what should competitive carriers in particular, or any carrier, what's the one thing that they need to know about public safety that they don't? And then conversely, what's the thing that public safety needs to know about competitive carriers, distinct from all carriers, that they don't know?
Well, I think the answer is the same for both, which is that despite the appearance to the contrary, there's actually the basis for an excellent partnership. Again, it's not to say that it will be easy to address governance issues with public safety, which doesn't come wrapped up in a single package. There's so many different levels of public safety, and you're going to want as many of those levels as you can get because you want as much buy-in to the system as you can get. So it's a little bit easier when you're looking at the other part of the public-private partnership, but as the baseline, public safety, when appropriately organized and listened to for its requirements, is going to turn out to be that very elusive thing for the wireless industry, which is a customer that does not churn, a customer which is the opposite of churn, which just digs in year by year more and more into the network. So there's everything to be gained by this, and except when bad things are happening, and public safety needs to have the spectrum available for when bad things happen, because bad things all too clearly do happen. There's a tremendous amount of excess capacity. That excess capacity is the means by which, with appropriate public-private partnerships, public safety can help finance the shortfall between the network that it dreams about and the $7 billion which showed up. I mean, you can count me the most surprised person on the planet when $7 billion showed up. That's fantastic, but it's simply nowhere near enough. And so the thorny issue is to figure out how to structure a public-private partnership. I think it has to be on a state-by-state basis. Mm-hmm. It has to include every relevant element of public safety. It has to work through the thorny governance issues to get to where public safety feels comfortable with the control which it must have over the levers of the network. And then to work it out in such a way that it is sustaining over time as a business, because you're going to have to be able to sell that excess capacity, monetize that excess capacity to help pick up the operating expenses of this network, which are going to be enormous. Your membership here, my strong feeling is that the category of wireless carrier that isn't consumed by Verizon, AT&T, that's the element. That's going to be that's the wild card that can make this whole thing work. So my message, to the extent that I have one to this audience, is get very aggressive. Do not be polite and sit back. Clamor to be included in this process. There is so much to be gained.
That's excellent. I did want to follow up, and though I'd encourage all of the panelists to respond to this question as you see fit, but you mentioned a customer that doesn't churn, and I did think I saw a few people wipe the drool from their mouths when you mentioned that, because it's so attractive, because churn is such a negative for any carrier of any size. That suggests that there might be a major first mover advantage, though, to securing that FirstNet business. How do you see those contracts being let? How do you see those opportunities? Are they to arise every few years? Is it all about who gets in first? Is it locally specific? Is it geographically dominated? What happens in terms of deployment, build out, and specifically contracting with commercial operators, or for that matter, utilities?
I think the short answer is nobody knows.
Right.
The challenge for FirstNet is to stay true to the overriding concept of a nationwide network that's interoperable, et cetera, et cetera. On the other hand, pick up every reasonable opportunity for constructive relationships out there that will allow them to get this monster system built and have it sustain itself, because I don't know which is more difficult, the capital to build it or the capital to fund the operating expenses, but both of them are like Mount Olympus, and to get to the top of those, they're going to have to be multi-dimensional relationships, and how we could even be discussing whether the utilities would play. I mean, public safety has to consider that critical to get the utilities to want to play. I mean, who would be better to be on that network? But then again, if you're public safety and you have priority access, you shouldn't care who else is on that network. It should be who will pay me the most to use it, because I got site rent to pay and I have whatever.
That's a great point. Anyone else on that point? Brett?
I'll jump in. Morgan said that one thing I think is also very important is that the public-private partnership should be at the state level. Because I'll purloin unabashedly from Chris McIntosh, who's the interoperability coordinator for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And Chris gave a speech at NGA talking about that this is a fiscal issue for the states, a procedural issue, and then a philosophical issue. And fiscally, the states have to figure out what they can pay for, what they can afford, for what applications. Procedurally, you have to follow the state's procedures, legislative parts, and philosophically is how do they think about running their systems relationship to FirstNet. State laws vary incredibly, and so public-private partnership, I think, needs to be at the state level just because it's the simplest path to making this successful. And as I mentioned earlier, you all, your carriers are part of that business framework for the state, same as the utilities. And so that is, you want to have that working knowledge of that state and the state officials, et cetera. And then that's the fastest way to implement it. I would point out that Nevada and Michigan, and their waivers included utilities as part of their waivers. Michigan, on their public safety system, has done a phenomenal statewide program of making sure that they try and include cities and counties. Ohio's MARC system is also a very good kind of example. So I think there are states out there who have built out systems that work with utilities, that work with other entities, that can be used as models for other states, but it should be a kind of a state-centric view.
Do you view, just a quick follow-up, but we get hear from Brett, but do you view 50 RFPs as going out separate for states with a common set of specifications, or would it be done through one national RFP? In your view, obviously we don't know what FirstNet will do, but what's optimal? Well,
I think and I was very pleased to hear Sue Swenson's comment that they're going to be reaching out to the governors directly in addition to the NGA. I think governors can help drive that process, and the companies here can help guide their governors in this process. I don't know if there's 50 RFPs or how FirstNet is thinking about it, but I would take the other turn. I think the states can drive their own future. So once again, I'll use Virginia and Mackinac, which is the Association of Mid-Atlantic States. They're getting ready. So they're not waiting. And I commend other states like Nevada who are created boards under the Governor Sandoval's purview to get moving. So that way the state's going to take advantage of the process. So that way FirstNet knows what the state needs. But also at the end of the day, that's what the governor is elected to do. Make sure they promote and protect their constituents.
Brett Kilbourne?
Okay. Just to pick up on one of the things, I do agree with Morgan that it's way too early to tell, what the life cycle issues are and such for the business model. But I think a lot of folks recognize that, having your, anchor customer as a utility will help drive down those costs because we've got so many potential end-use devices that are associated with smart grid. And so when you're trying to make this a sustainable network, not just one that you can actually build out using the $7 billion for your capital expenses, that's, not to pat ourselves on the back and again, but it's another reason that, public safety should be looking to try and share this network with utility companies. And there, to the larger issue of how you do it, there are models that are out there. Utilities have been sharing networks with public safety in a number of different states. Hence the reason that Michigan and Nevada, proposed that they actually share the PSBN with utility companies because they do have experience in doing narrowband systems with utility companies, and it's worked very well because they recognized early on that neither one of the two sides could build the network by themselves. And moreover, by virtue of combining their resources, they were able to build a network that was better than, the two combined. So the sum of the two parts is greater than the whole. And as a practical matter, it's a relatively simple model. It's like a cost-sharing model. So it could be as easy as that. And UTC put together a white paper that's posted on our website that describes those sharing arrangements when we look at the business models that FirstNet might want to try and use when it's constructing the RFP.
So would you encourage competitive carriers such as those attending this convention to reach out to their local utility?
Oh, yeah, sure. Absolutely. The more the merrier. We are really actively looking for partners. And we've had a number of different workshops around the country. Those workshops have been focused on trying to bring utility companies together with public safety and state and local. And we've done that. But I think that there is an opportunity now that we've gotten sort of momentum generated to work with the CCA going forward.
Great point. Patrick, please.
Yeah. So just to continue on that, on the state level and the utilities and other accessing this. So we heard Sue Swenson talk this morning about this is going to be a public safety grade network. And I just want to point out that that brings an opportunity into public-private partnership, because now you're talking about a network that may be different than a commercial network that may attract new types of clients. And that could be very attractive from a public-private partnership point of view. And many of those clients are local in nature: utilities, transportation. Could also be a number of other. Oil and gas is another example of industries that could be really desire this type of public safety grade network. So I think there are opportunities, and those are best addressed on a state level, and to understand what assets and what the plans are within the states, because as was pointed out earlier, each state is different and there are different regulations and rules there.
Well, Patrick, just following up on that point, and especially given your experience as Vice President of Wireless Networks at Erickson, is 20 megahertz, which is what public safety will have, is it enough to do utilities and commercial carriers and the workaday needs of public safety? Will they have enough to spare? I mean, we do have 2 million public safety users out there. That's not an enormous number, but will the resources be sufficient to tap all the different potential revenue pools?
So then now you're coming back into, again, the differences between how public safety builds and designs their network versus a commercial carrier. Public safety primarily builds it for coverage and incidents. They want to cover what happens in an incident and at any geography. Commercial carriers build it for different reasons. It's also so that public safety use is average use outside the incidents is not nearly at the level of the incidents. So yes, if you're looking at it from a total network point of view, I do believe there are spare capacity. The key here is, as Sue talked about this morning, is the priority access. So when it is needed at an incident, where it happens, in the intersection or wherever, that very local area where it happens, public safety gets enough access to the spectrum that they need. And that may mean that in that particular geography, the secondary users may experience some lower customer experience in that. But that could be, I think in many cases, that could be acceptable so for these secondary users. So I think it's important to understand that you have this difference between average and peak incident use.
Right. I think that's a really important point. And for that, maybe I wanted to turn briefly to Brett and perhaps Morgan as well. Part of the challenge, I think, on the commercial carrier side is making the public safety peaks and valleys routinized and predictable enough to actually make some sensible business plans around to support that public-private partnership. And I know, Brett, you've spoken about fundamental questions with public safety use and how to define what the start and end point of a incident is. I mean, how do you know when the emergency starts? Is it and just as important, when it ends? Is it when the bomb goes off? And is it when the last tent or police barricade is taken down? What are the beginning and end points, as well as who decides how that process is defined, both the start and end point? So are we any closer to understanding these fundamental questions of what's an incident and how that might work in a public-private partnership with a commercial carrier?
I don't know if we're any closer, but I think the process has started. And once again, to hammer home, at the state level, the governor usually has the legal authority to declare an emergency, and that varies state by state. Obviously, the governor works closely with the counties and the cities because an incident is rarely statewide, but is localized. Clearly, carriers want to have some sort of a certainty in order to make their plans, what triggers an incident, how they framework. And once again, at the state level, I think this is much more manageable. It becomes much more operational, that you can talk to your governor's offices, you can talk to the city and county officials. I would also say you can talk to the utilities. And as I said earlier, public safety is not just 700, it's a holistic public safety. Keep in mind that public safety still has lots of embedded assets. So I would encourage talking to public safety and their vendors at the local level. National public safety leadership, like APCO from Jeff Cohn, has a very good role to play. But really, the local public safety users and their vendors really know their systems, and that's where you can start to have that dialogue so that they understand what each side needs to appreciate from the other perspective.
Do you have any, if you were writing the rules on how these events were defined or what the baseline criteria for commercial operation would be, what do you think is critical that we see? I mean, what needs to be defined and how would you define it?
I think what you want is clarity, upfront clarity in terms of when public safety obviously needs to have priority access, and then clarity in terms of the beginning and end parts to it. You know, thank God, you know, incidents are not long-term, except for example, Katrina, where you do have massive incidents where the governor needs to bring in the National Guard and other entities. But excuse me, you want some sort of a clarity from the carrier perspective, but also public safety wants that clarity too, because they want to make sure that they have the priority access that they demand, and what is to them is mission critical, that part.
And Morgan, I know you spent a lot of time thinking about this very topic at Siren Call. What do you think? How should we define these incidents?
You have to have clarity, and to me it's very clear. The spectrum belongs to public safety on the condition that public safety gets priority access for doing its job. So anybody sitting down with public safety to discuss sharing the spectrum starts on that premise. And out of that process of discussing how the priority is actually going to be manifested in the way a network operates, protocols will develop. I think, again, the protocols, like Brett is saying, the protocols in one state may differ very much from the protocols in another. The way the state handles an emergency versus the way a large municipality in that state handles it and how they work that out. I mean, it's better for those of us that aren't public safety to only facilitate that process and not try to second guess that. That's the essence of what the public part of public private partnership does. And it's just, while I know that it's going to be very difficult to try to anticipate all the situations, if you start with the premise that public safety basically always has priority access, it does make it easier.
Patrick, I wanted to talk briefly about a different type of protocol. Back in 2001, you visited the FCC and urged the FCC to tell public safety to stop reinventing the wheel, coming up with different sector-specific standards because they're messing up your LTE standards and risk fracturing what is otherwise a very well-harmonized standard. Do you feel that same way today, or has public safety continued down that path? I mean, we know that the Boulder test labs are pursuing their own verification and testing process. I mean, to date, that seems really to involve a lot of testing under extreme conditions. But I suppose that risk remains. Do you still feel that same way, that the FCC needs to step in, or perhaps NTIA or FirstNet, to really assure a baseline of operation?
I think it's important to understand that when we're going into this LTE public safety network, public safety will enter a new ecosystem that they're not used to. And I do believe, and I see that and hear that from public safety constituents, that they're aware of this, including PSCR, so that they understand that this is a different ecosystem, a different industry than the traditional LMR industry. So this goes also for the wireless industry, like I'm coming from, that we need to understand the public safety. So you need to understand and meet in the middle. Now, what you want to do is to, when you enter this ecosystem, is to leverage the global scale of the ecosystem. And to do that, it is important that you play by the rules of that industry to gain the greatest leverage. And I think that's where my comments were coming from at that time. I think things have changed. I think public safety is acknowledging that, and I hear that from FirstNet, I hear that from PSCR. So I think that is happening. One good example of PSCR actually embracing this is their participation in 3GPP. They are embracing this. They are participating in the wireless industry ecosystem forums. Yes, they are doing some testing, and that's probably appropriate because public safety is different than wireless industry. So that's where what is appropriate, and I think that could be a fine line. That needs something that needs to be discussed, and FirstNet and the industry has a big role to play in that. So I think since that meeting, whenever it was, that I think a lot of things has changed, and I think we have a common ground at this point in time.
That's great. Other thoughts on that topic before we go to our next question? I did want to say after this question, I'm going to turn it over to the audience for a little Q&A. So start thinking about what you might ask our panelists. But Morgan, given your experience in the past with public safety, do you have any practical tips as to how to formulate that public-private partnership? Maybe beyond spending time with public safety, understanding their needs, putting public safety first, what should competitive carriers think about if they're approaching a partnership of this sort?
Well, you want to know how big is the customer? What kind of commitments is that customer willing to make in return for whatever obligations you as the private side of the public-private partnership are considering making? And this gets back to a point that Patrick was making. I mean, obviously these public-private partnerships only work if everyone perceives them to be in his benefit. Not that everybody perceives them to be a total win, because that's going to be difficult to achieve. It's going to be a balancing act. But one of the numerous reasons for wanting to have the state as an aggressive part of structuring these type of public-private partnerships and participating from the ground up is that they are a customer. They're going to sign up or not sign up to use the network. The fact that a nationwide public safety system shows up in town does not mean that anybody is required to use it. It's going to have the same challenge every other wireless offering has. It has to demonstrate that it's the best choice for performance and price. So to the extent that you're in a constructive public-private partnership, you want your public partner to be satisfied with the way the network is going to be constructed, and to show that by making commitments and signing up for it. That's what makes them a terrific customer. And I would say the same thing about the utility. I'd want them sitting right at that same table. Of course we want you in this network. Of course we want you to have a level of priority. How many units and at what price?
Excellent. I've got a few more questions, but I did want to turn it over to the audience in our last 10, 15 minutes here and make sure that we take advantage of the expertise and talent that's in the room here. Any questions from the audience at this point? All right, well, then this allows me to turn to my next question. If anyone does, just please raise your hand. We've got mics available. One thing that we haven't talked about, we spent a fair amount of time talking about public safety, about utilities, about carriers. There is another potential participant, that's integrators. What's the role of integrators in this environment? Where do you see them fitting in? I'll just open it up to anyone on the panel. And by this, I mean someone who can manage the end-to-end experience from both, say, a vendor, OEM, network management, data security, the apps experience, the device. I mean, pulling all that together is likely to exceed the capabilities of a small, so far small, FirstNet structure. How will integrators fit into this puzzle? Yeah, Patrick, please.
Do you want to go for it? So it's a very interesting question, because you bring in a couple of different aspects into this, right? You have a commercial technology, LTE technology, into a public safety environment. So similar to what you're talking about on the operational side of this, you can almost think about the same type of need on the supplier side of this, for a partnership between LTE experience and public safety experience. So I think that if that is an integrator role or not, I'm not so sure, but I want to point out that there are different experiences that they'll bring to bear in here, and that both the commercial LTE experience and the public safety experience are an important competence that's needed in any of the suppliers here.
did you want to add to that?
Again, as with so many of these details, I think we have to say it will depend on how FirstNet decides it wants to. When FirstNet thinks about a nationwide network, what do they really mean? And how are they going to get the services provided all the way through that build, finance, construct, operate? How are they going to take all those services through and at the end have everybody happy? I mean, I can't imagine that there aren't significant roles that system integrators will have to play in that, because we're talking complicated, very complicated. There's an irreducible element of complexity if you want to get it right.
And as a large integration firm, I have to respond. But I was waiting for that
might
pause.
have an opinion on this, Brett.
But also that integration just isn't an IT integration. It's the integration of governance, policies, procedures, because at the end of the day, whether it's at the state level or the national level, taxpayers, Congress want to have oversight and want to make sure that this national asset, this 20 megahertz of spectrum, this potential $7 billion, is being spent wisely and in a fair, open, and transparent way. So your integration is also integration of making sure that all the stakeholders know what's going on, when it's going, and why, and also that the governor or also the Senate, the House of Representatives can understand how FirstNet is proceeding, so they have a high level of comfort that this national asset is being used in the most appropriate and efficient way.
Well, just to push back a little bit on that, if we do have this very state-centric approach, and one state, let's say New York, gets ample funding and really has an aggressive build-out schedule and all the cylinders are firing at once, and another state, say Connecticut, doesn't for any sorts of reasons, budgetary or just legislative dysfunction, all kinds of things could go sideways. How do you assure that the network remains coherent and national in scope when you're really dependent on that state consultation, which may or may not be forthcoming?
I think from a technical perspective, I think Admiral Barnett from the FCC and the colleagues who did the FCC's interoperability technical standards set a very good bar. And because they're using a commercial standard, I think many of the technical issues can be addressed. They're difficult as they are. I think it's a possibility to address them. What you want to do is make sure that you, as Sue Swenson mentioned earlier, you're including all states. So it's urban and rural as well, so that it's not a feeling of have and have-nots. And that's one of the challenges FirstNet is going to have to figure out, is how to allocate the $7 billion in revenue. I think some states could be these early builders or early adapters, could be role models for other states that are out there, and they can do lessons learned, whether from the BTOP recipients or possible other ones. I'll use Nevada as an example. Governor Sandoval, I praise him and Senator Reid, really took the initiative, and they created a board specifically for 700, the Sonnet board, which incorporates energy, incorporates fire, incorporates obviously the public safety, and transportation. So they already have kind of a holistic system to address it, not just looking at 700, but how does 700 fit within the state's broadband and then public safety needs. So I think you're going to have some fast movers at states, and those should be seen as role models for the other states.
Sure. Please, Morgan.
You can't oversimplify this, but one way of looking at the role of FirstNet is spectrum landlord. They hold 20 megahertz of spectrum, and they're the landlord. What they charge for use of that spectrum is, I think, completely up to their discretion. So they can manage the haves, have-nots in what they perceive to be the best national interest by the way in which they get compensation for the spectrum that they're essentially leasing to these various RAN operations. While, of course, it will be very complicated to figure this all out, the concept is pretty simple.
Just to question you on that one point. We have $7 billion. That's fairly universally recognized as insufficient to build a nationwide interoperable public safety network, especially one that's hardened to public safety standards. If we're allowing states to move at different rates and each setting their own schedules, does it become a race to the front of the line before the money runs out? How is that function managed?
The last thing I want to do is tell FirstNet how to do their
Sure.
business, although I'll give them my telephone number if they want to ask. To me, a way to approach this is to figure out how much is the excess capacity worth in the major markets, because it's worth a very large number. There's a lot of it. There's a lot of excess capacity available on 20 megahertz of LTE deployment, which public safety will not be using under normal circumstances 99% of the time, a lot of it. So once that's quantified, and once the several different alternatives are explored for how to most effectively monetize that, I believe FirstNet can go a long way towards addressing some of the shortfall. That's the largest unknown on the positive side is how much of the gap can be plugged. Going past that, your issue of the timing, I mean, again, that's completely up to FirstNet, because as landlord of that spectrum, they have to approve any deals that are made state by state, and they have complete discretion to do that in the sequence in which they think is best. You know, I think it's a pretty intelligent structure that Congress put in place with a national oversight to make sure that the federal objectives are met. But I would assume that there's going to be a lot of local discretion as long as it's consistent with those overall objectives.
Patrick?
So the question, I think, is about how you avoid the balkanization of all these networks, right?
Yes.
It's a very interesting topic, and I think that we got some clues to that on our FirstNet with approach that when Sue talked this morning, and I think they're on the right track. And it's really about the governance on a national level. And in my mind, that is one of the key roles that FirstNet will play, is to provide that governance, to provide that consistency on a nationwide basis. Mm-hmm. And that could take form, many different forms. It could be in an architecture structure, it could be a roadmap alignment, could be some assets that are put in place that connects all these things. But it's clearly, I heard this morning that FirstNet has this ambition and this plan to provide this national structure where each of the different components fits in. And I think that's a very key element to avoid this balkanization and truly get the nationwide network.
And just one other idea. I mean, I think a lot of the answers are right in this room. You know, one of the ways you can overcome the problem by trying to monetize the network, or you can remove the problem by actually relying on infrastructure that's already in rural areas. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's up to FirstNet. You know, going back to Morgan's point, we have no idea how FirstNet is going to address this, but it would be very important for them to think outside the box instead of just assuming that no solution exists in rural areas, therefore we have to build from the inside out. There may very well be solutions that are sitting right there in this room that can answer this problem.
Thank you. Actually, I think that's an excellent point to end on. Unless there are any questions from the audience, we probably have time for one if there is. If not, I want to thank again our panelists. Sorry, did we have?
There was one hand.
Okay, please. We have time for one question. I think we're going to get you a microphone. Just a moment.
I have a hard time seeing where in the rural areas we're able to have specific examples of being able to monetize this interoperable spectrum. Can you give us some, you know, types of examples where, you know, right now, in a lot of us, we have sufficient spectrum.
Right. So in rural areas, we have low population density. You won't generate the revenue because the spectrum demand is not there. Morgan or Brent?
Well, let me take one stab at it, but with the proviso that I certainly don't want to tell you your business. But if you have 700 megahertz spectrum, but you haven't deployed LTE, but by definition, you'll be deploying LTE in some of the same area that FirstNet will be deploying it if they intend to build nationally. A way of monetizing capacity for FirstNet is to simply split the construction cost with you and then agree to use your facilities to for roaming and give you roaming capabilities on the rest of their facilities, and just spend less capital. Each of you spends less capital than you otherwise would have because you're building shared facilities. It's not the same model that would apply if you're talking about squeezing the excess capacity value out of Boston, for example. We know it's different in the rural area, but there's still some principles of sharing that would make sense.
And I would add, depending on your carrier spectrum footprint, but this is 20 megahertz nationwide, and particularly for rural states, and we've been working with the kind of western states on this, where there's heavy federal users, heavy federal presence in the western states. Utilities have a clear role, but also public safety has different demands in rural states than, let's say, large urban areas. You know, forest fires in the Intermountain West are one of the main issues. But you as a carrier can think of, just as Morgan pointed out, as kind of a sharing concept, but also this is an opportunity for the governor's broadband vision for his or her state to provide what I call schools, hospitals, and libraries. Clearly, public safety is the bedrock. So I completely agree that this is the first and foremost framework is public safety. But it's so much spectrum that there's an opportunity for the state to think about how it can serve, first, its public safety ecosystem, so not just 700, but 800, T-band, et cetera, but then also the state's other broadband initiatives. So you can provide rural health care, other areas. That's where I think a carrier can participate, because it's an enormous swath of spectrum that can be used for other services on a secondary basis, particularly in rural areas where public safety demands are not the same as in large urban areas.
And I think that will probably have to be our last word. I want to thank Brett Hahn, Brett Kilbourne, Morgan O'Brien, Patrick Rehnquist. Each of you have given us a really insightful and helpful perspective, and hopefully have helped carriers here make it a win-win. Thanks so much. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.